On January 11, 2026, the Department of Justice served grand jury subpoenas on the Federal Reserve of the United States, threatening criminal indictment of its chair, Jerome Powell. This wasn't about a bank robbery. This wasn't about fraud at a regional branch. This was the Trump administration's Justice Department going after the man who controls American monetary policy over a building renovation. Powell didn't stay quiet. Within hours, he released a video statement accusing the DOJ of using the probe as a pressure tactic to force the Fed to lower interest rates in line with the administration's demands. He called it an unprecedented action that should be seen in the broader context of the administration's threats and ongoing pressure. That's the sitting Federal Reserve chair publicly accusing the president's Justice Department of political intimidation. That matters, because what happens next could determine whether the institution that controls American interest rates remains independent or becomes another arm of whoever occupies the White House. And here's where this story takes an unexpected turn. Republican senators, members of Trump's own party, started breaking ranks almost immediately. Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina, a member of the Senate Banking Committee, didn't mince words. He said if there was any remaining doubt whether advisors within the Trump administration are actively pushing to end the independence of the Federal Reserve, there should now be none. Then he made a promise. He would block all of Trump's Federal Reserve nominees until the investigation is resolved, every single one. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska followed within hours. After speaking directly with Powell, she described the probe as grounds to do nothing but intimidate, threaten, and coerce. She joined Tillis in pledging to block nominees. 2 Republican senators now standing between Trump and his ability to reshape the Federal Reserve. This is the same Lisa Murkowski who has clashed with Trump before, the same Thom Tillis who is retiring after this term and has less reason to fear political retaliation. But their defiance puts a spotlight on a fracture within the Republican Party over something fundamental, whether the central bank that sets interest rates should answer to the president. Senate Majority Leader John Thune tried to walk a careful line. He acknowledged the probe needs to be resolved quickly to ensure there's no political interference in monetary policy, but he stopped short of condemning it outright. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana said he would be stunned if Powell had done anything wrong and warned against escalating what he called a pissing match. Even Senator Cynthia Lummis, a Wyoming Republican who has been critical of the Fed's spending, acknowledged that while mismanagement might be possible, she doubted Powell intentionally misled Congress. That's the situation right now. The Justice Department is pursuing a criminal investigation into the Federal Reserve chair. Multiple Republican senators are openly defying the administration's approach. And Jerome Powell is framing this as nothing less than an attack on the independence of American monetary policy. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what the Federal Reserve actually does and why its independence has been considered untouchable for over a century. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and from the beginning, it was designed to operate outside of direct political control. The reason is simple. Interest rates affect everything: your mortgage, your car loan, business investments, the job market. When rates go up, borrowing becomes more expensive, which slows down the economy and fights inflation. When rates go down, borrowing gets cheaper, which stimulates growth but can also fuel inflation if done too aggressively. Presidents, understandably, tend to want lower interest rates. Lower rates make the economy feel better in the short term. They make voters happy, they boost the stock market. But if a president could simply order the Fed to slash rates before an election, the consequences could be disastrous. You'd get short-term sugar highs followed by inflation spirals. The 1970s showed exactly what happens when political pressure corrupts monetary policy. Inflation hit 15% by 1980. The purchasing power of American savings evaporated, so the Fed was structured to be independent. The president appoints the chair and board members, but once they're in place, they're supposed to make decisions based on economic data, not political pressure. The chair serves a 4-year term and can only be removed for cause, which has traditionally meant serious misconduct, not policy disagreements. Trump has been frustrated with Powell since his first term. He appointed Powell in 2017, then almost immediately regretted it when Powell didn't cut rates as aggressively as Trump wanted. Over the years, Trump has called Powell a political hack, a numbskull, a dumb guy, and an obvious Trump hater. In September 2024, during the campaign, Trump suggested the president should have a say in interest rate decisions. Powell's term as chair expires in May 2026. Trump has made it clear he wants someone more aligned with his economic vision. The probe appears to be part of a pressure campaign to either force Powell out early or weaken his position. Now let's look at what the investigation actually claims. The probe centers on Powell's testimony before the Senate Banking Committee in June 2025 regarding the Federal Reserve's headquarters renovation project. The Fed's Martin Building in Washington, D.C. has been undergoing extensive renovations that have ballooned in cost. Originally estimated at around $1.8 billion, the project grew to approximately $2.5 billion, with the Fed attributing the increase to inflation, supply chain disruptions, asbestos removal, soil contamination, and enhanced security features. During his testimony, Powell denied that the renovation included extravagant elements. Critics, including some House Republicans, had suggested the project featured luxuries like gold-plated fixtures and VIP dining rooms. Powell pushed back on those characterizations. The criminal referral that sparked the DOJ investigation came from Representative Anna Paulina Luna, a Florida Republican, in July 2025. She alleged Powell made false statements to Congress about the project's costs and management. The probe was approved by Jeanine Pirro, who Trump appointed as U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. That's the same Jeanine Pirro who was a Fox News host and vocal Trump ally before taking the position. Here's where this falls apart for anyone trying to view this as a straightforward accountability investigation. The timing is incredibly convenient. The probe surfaced just as Trump is preparing to nominate Powell's replacement. Powell's term ends in May. Trump has a short list of 5 candidates. Going after Powell with criminal threats right now maximizes pressure at the exact moment it could benefit the administration's personnel goals. Powell himself drew this connection explicitly. In his video statement, he said this is about whether the Fed will be able to continue to set interest rates based on evidence and economic conditions, or whether instead monetary policy will be directed by political pressure or intimidation. He's essentially saying this isn't about a building, this is about interest rates. This is about control. The response from former Fed officials has been extraordinary. 3 former Federal Reserve chairs, Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, and Janet Yellen, joined with former Treasury secretaries, including Robert Rubin and Henry Paulson, to issue a joint statement condemning the probe. They called it an unprecedented attempt to use prosecutorial attacks to undermine the Fed's independence. They drew comparisons to monetary policy in emerging markets with weak institutions, where political interference has highly negative consequences for inflation. That's not partisan rhetoric. That's bipartisan alarm from people who have actually run American monetary policy. Some analysts have called this the Maduro option, referencing the Venezuelan president's authoritarian tactics to seize control of independent institutions. That comparison is deliberately provocative, but it captures the concern that the probe represents an attempt to break norms that have protected economic stability for generations. Trump has denied directing the investigation. In a phone interview with NBC News on January 12th, he said, "I don't know anything about it," while simultaneously criticizing Powell as not very good at the Fed and not very good at building buildings. When asked if the probe was leveraged to influence rate decisions, he responded, "No, I wouldn't even think of doing it that way." The denial is technically plausible. Presidents generally don't directly order criminal investigations. But the probe emerged from his appointee's office, targets someone he's publicly attacked for years, and arrives at the exact moment that maximizes political utility. The circumstantial alignment is difficult to ignore. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt reinforced the administration's position that Trump did not direct prosecutors. But critics note that the culture of an administration matters. Officials don't always need explicit orders. They can anticipate what the boss wants. Let's talk about what happens inside the Senate. the Senate Banking Committee is responsible for vetting Federal Reserve nominees before they can receive a full Senate vote. The committee currently has 13 Republicans and 11 Democrats, chaired by Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, with Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts as the ranking member. Here's the math that matters. If Tillis and Murkowski follow through on their pledge to block nominees, that potentially creates a 12-12 tie on the committee. A tied vote doesn't advance a nomination. Even if committee leadership found procedural workarounds, broader defections could prevent Trump from getting nominees through the full Senate. This has direct consequences for Trump's agenda. He wants to replace Powell with someone who shares his view that rates should be lower. He wants a Fed that responds to his economic priorities. But if Republican senators are blocking his nominees until the probe is resolved, his window for reshaping the Fed shrinks dramatically. Powell's term ends in May. If no new chair is confirmed by then, the Federal Reserve Board could appoint Powell as chair pro tempore, essentially extending his influence indefinitely. That would be the opposite of what the administration wants. Senator Warren has called on the Banking Committee to halt consideration of all Trump nominees to the Fed, accusing Trump of trying to install a sock puppet and behaving like a wannabe dictator. Democrats are unified in opposition. The question is how many Republicans join them. The probe has also triggered a wave of concern about what it means for markets and the economy. Markets initially sold off on January 12th when the news broke. The Dow dropped as much as 0.8% intraday, about 400 points. But by the close, major indices had recovered. The S&P 500 and Dow actually finished at record highs. That might seem like markets shrugging off the news, but other indicators tell a more concerning story. Gold surged 2.5% to a record $4,604 per ounce. Silver jumped 7.3% to $84.61. When gold rallies like that, it signals investors are seeking safe havens. They're hedging against uncertainty. They're worried about something. Treasury yields also rose, with the 10-year note climbing to around 4.20%. Higher yields on government bonds suggest investors are demanding a political risk premium. They want more compensation for holding American debt because they're less certain about the stability of American institutions. The dollar weakened to its lowest level in 3 weeks. Bitcoin held steady near $92,000, with some analysts noting that the turmoil reinforced its appeal as a neutral asset outside traditional financial systems. Economists have been sounding alarms. Mark Zandi of Moody's Analytics warned there's nothing but downside for investors and consumers, predicting higher inflation and rates that could sour the economy. Brett House from Columbia Business School called it an assault on the Fed's independence, forecasting higher rates, volatility, and uncertainty for consumers. Jarrett Seiberg of TD Cowen noted it might result in higher interest rates as the market questions the Fed's ability to respond if there are signs of inflation. That last point is crucial. The Fed's main job is fighting inflation. If markets believe the Fed can't act independently because it's under political pressure, they start building inflation expectations into prices. That becomes self-fulfilling. If everyone expects inflation, it tends to happen. Mohamed El-Erian, one of the most respected economists in the world, highlighted risks to the Fed's already fragile public standing. Jason Furman of Harvard argued the probe mimics tactics from countries with weak institutions, potentially leading to highly negative consequences for inflation. The historical parallel people keep citing is the 1970s. Under Presidents Johnson and Nixon, there was significant political pressure on the Federal Reserve to keep rates low. That contributed to inflation spiraling out of control. By 1980, inflation had reached 15%. It took Federal Reserve Chair Paul Volcker raising rates to nearly 20% to finally break the inflation cycle. That caused a severe recession but ultimately restored price stability. Mark Higgins from Index Fund Advisors explicitly drew this parallel, warning that political pressure could make inflation harder to contain with long-term negative effects. The lesson from the 1970s is clear. Short-term political convenience creates long-term economic pain. There's another dimension to this that hasn't received enough attention. The probe creates uncertainty about what future Fed officials will face. Michael A. Gayed raised a critical point. If future officials fear legal consequences for conflicting with political priorities, it might shift policy towards short-term whims. If future Fed officials believe they could face legal exposure for decisions that conflict with political priorities, he warned, it shifts incentives in dangerous ways. Think about that. If you're a potential Fed nominee watching this unfold, you're seeing the current chair face criminal investigation for testimony about a building project. You might reasonably conclude that defying presidential preferences on interest rates could lead to similar treatment. Even if Powell prevails, the chilling effect is already occurring. Future officials might self-censor. They might accommodate political demands they would otherwise resist. The probe doesn't have to succeed to change behavior. Krishna Guha from Evercore ISI predicted the probe would actually unite the Fed around Powell, potentially isolating Trump's nominees and derailing efforts to shift the Federal Open Market Committee's composition. That's the committee that actually votes on interest rates. If existing Fed officials rally behind Powell while Trump struggles to get new nominees confirmed, the administration's ability to influence monetary policy could be weaker than before the probe started. There's an irony here. Trump wants lower interest rates. That's his stated goal. He believes high rates are hurting the economy and costing him political support, but the probe itself might be pushing rates higher. When markets perceive threats to Fed independence, they demand higher yields on Treasury bonds to compensate for the risk. Higher Treasury yields translate into higher mortgage rates, higher car loan rates, higher borrowing costs across the economy. Wilmer Stith from Wilmington Trust forecasted higher bond yields specifically because of doubts about the Fed's ability to control inflation. That directly contradicts the administration's economic goals. The probe might be achieving the opposite of what Trump wants. International observers have weighed in as well. Christine Lagarde of the European Central Bank and Andrew Bailey of the Bank of England both expressed support for Powell, affirming that central bank independence is a cornerstone of economic stability. When central bankers from allied nations feel compelled to defend their American counterpart, that itself signals how unusual this situation is. Some Trump allies have defended the probe as necessary accountability. William Poult, director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, framed it as essential oversight of what he called wasteful spending. He described the Fed renovation as a Palace of Versailles style extravagance that warrants scrutiny. That's a legitimate debate to have. Government spending should face oversight. If the Fed renovation involved genuine waste or mismanagement, that deserves examination. But critics argue the issue is the vehicle being used. Congressional oversight and GAO audits are the normal mechanisms for scrutinizing agency spending. Criminal investigations of the Fed chair are not. The question isn't whether the Fed should face accountability. It's whether criminal prosecution is an appropriate tool for policy disputes, and whether the timing and circumstances suggest the probe is really about something else entirely. Powell has retained high-profile legal counsel from Williams and Connolly, signaling he's prepared for a prolonged fight. Betting markets like Polymarket estimate only a 12% chance Powell will actually face charges by June 2026. Many observers expect the probe to either fizzle or be dropped, particularly if political pressure mounts. But that might not matter as much as you'd think. The damage from the probe doesn't require charges. The damage comes from the precedent. The damage comes from the signal it sends to future Fed officials. The damage comes from the erosion of confidence in American institutions. Former Deputy Treasury Secretary Sarah Bloom Raskin called the probe the stuff of tin pot dictators. That's harsh language from a former senior official, but it reflects a genuine concern that what's happening crosses a line that previous administrations of both parties did not cross. The Republican senators who are pushing back understand what's at stake. Tillis and Murkowski aren't doing this because they love Jerome Powell's monetary policy. They're doing it because they recognize that if this precedent holds, future administrations of either party will have a playbook for pressuring the Fed. The short-term political advantage isn't worth the long-term institutional damage. Senator Thune's caution reflects a different calculation. He's trying to maintain party unity while acknowledging that the probe looks problematic. His warning that it better be serious suggests he's not convinced it is, but he's not ready to openly defy the administration. Other Republican senators are threading similar needles. Kevin Cramer of North Dakota called Powell a bad Fed chair, but not a criminal. French Hill, who chairs the House Financial Services Committee, has defended Powell's integrity. These are members of Trump's own party expressing skepticism about an investigation led by Trump's own appointees. House Republicans have been more divided. Some MAGA-aligned members support the scrutiny. Others recognize the risks. The bipartisan consensus among former officials and economists creates pressure that even loyal Republicans can't entirely ignore. Here's where we are as of now. The DOJ investigation is ongoing. Grand jury subpoenas have been served. The Federal Reserve is presumably cooperating while Powell publicly contests the legitimacy of the probe. 2 Republican senators have committed to blocking Trump's Fed nominees. Others have expressed varying degrees of concern. Former Fed chairs and Treasury secretaries have issued an unprecedented joint statement condemning the investigation. Markets are watching nervously, with safe haven assets spiking even as stocks recovered. Powell's term ends in May. If the standoff continues, the Senate may not confirm a replacement in time. That could leave Powell in an extended role or create a leadership vacuum at the most important economic institution in the world. The broader question isn't just about Jerome Powell. It's about whether the Federal Reserve will remain an independent institution that sets interest rates based on economic data or become an agency that responds to presidential preferences. That distinction has protected American economic stability for over a century. Once it's broken, it's very difficult to restore. Some argue the Fed is already too powerful, too unaccountable, that it makes decisions affecting millions of people without sufficient democratic oversight. That's a reasonable debate to have. But the answer to that concern isn't criminal investigations of the chair for testimony about building costs. The answer is structural reform through legislation, not prosecution. What happens next depends on several factors. How aggressively does the DOJ pursue the investigation? Do more Republican senators join Tillis and Murkowski in blocking nominees? Does the probe survive congressional scrutiny and public pressure? Does Trump back off, or does he double down? The evidence so far suggests this isn't going to resolve quickly. Powell has made clear he won't resign under pressure. The administration has made clear it views the probe as legitimate. Senate Republicans are split between loyalty to Trump and concern about institutional damage. We're watching a collision between executive power and institutional independence in real time. The Federal Reserve has weathered political pressure before. It has maintained its autonomy through multiple administrations. But the direct use of criminal investigation as a pressure tactic represents something new. It tests whether the norms that protect central bank independence can withstand a president willing to push past them. The economists and former officials sounding alarms aren't doing so because they disagree with Trump's policy preferences. Many of them have served under presidents of both parties. They're alarmed because they understand what's at stake if these norms collapse. Higher inflation, higher interest rates, less stable markets, a weaker dollar, reduced global confidence in American economic institutions. Those aren't hypothetical risks. They're the documented consequences of politicized monetary policy in countries around the world. The United States has avoided those outcomes for decades precisely because the Fed has been insulated from short-term political pressure. That insulation is being tested now. The outcome will shape American economic policy for years to come. The Senate Banking Committee's structure creates specific choke points that matter here. Senator Tim Scott chairs the committee. He's been measured in his statements, neither condemning the probe outright nor endorsing the blocking strategy. The 13 Republican members each have their own calculations to make. Some are closely aligned with Trump's agenda, others are more institutionalist. The probe forces each to choose between supporting the administration and protecting an institution they believe serves an important function. Elizabeth Warren, as ranking member, has been explicit about using every procedural tool to slow down nominees. Democrats are unified in opposition. They can't stop confirmations alone, but they can make the process painful and force floor votes that put Republicans on the record. Trump has been consistent on one point. He believes interest rates are too high. He's blamed Powell personally for rate decisions that he argues hurt economic growth. During the 2024 campaign, he suggested presidents should have a say in interest rate decisions. That preference has clear political logic. Lower rates stimulate borrowing and boost asset prices before elections, but lower rates also risk higher inflation. If markets believe the Fed is acting on political orders rather than economic analysis, inflation expectations become unmoored. The 1970s showed what happens when that goes wrong. Legal experts are skeptical the probe has merit. The Fed's renovation costs genuinely increased due to inflation, supply chain issues, and expanded scope. Proving Powell intentionally misled Congress would be extraordinarily difficult. Betting markets put the odds of actual charges at just 12%. But that might not matter. The damage doesn't require charges. The damage comes from the precedent. The damage comes from the signal to future Fed officials. The damage comes from the erosion of confidence. What remains unresolved is significant. Will more Republican senators join Tillis and Murkowski in blocking nominees? Will the probe survive congressional scrutiny? Will markets continue to price in political risk premiums? Will Powell complete his term in May, or will pressure force him out early? Powell has retained high-profile counsel from Williams and Connolly and signaled he's prepared for a prolonged fight. He's made clear he won't resign. The administration has made clear it views the probe as legitimate. The standoff could last months. Meanwhile, markets are watching. Every signal about Fed independence affects investment decisions worth trillions of dollars. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency rests partly on confidence that American monetary policy won't be subject to political whims. That confidence is being tested. 3 former Fed chairs and multiple former Treasury secretaries have called this an unprecedented threat. Central bankers from allied nations have expressed support for Powell. The bipartisan alarm from people who have actually run these institutions should be taken seriously. The question now isn't whether the probe was appropriate. That debate is already settled for most observers. The question is, what happens next? Does the administration back down under political and market pressure? Does Congress intervene to protect Fed independence? Do enough Republican senators defect to stall Trump's Fed nominees indefinitely? Or does this become the new normal? A precedent where future administrations of either party can threaten criminal investigation of Fed officials who don't comply with presidential preferences on interest rates? The answer will determine whether American monetary policy remains independent or becomes another battleground in partisan warfare. Right now, with Republican senators breaking ranks to defend the Fed chair against their own president's Justice Department, that question remains dangerously open. The fight is far from over, and the stakes extend far beyond Jerome Powell. Consider this. Every future Fed nominee will have watched this unfold. They'll know that taking positions the White House dislikes could trigger legal scrutiny. They'll face a choice between professional judgment and personal risk. Even if Powell emerges unscathed, that calculus has been fundamentally altered. The institution that controls whether your mortgage costs 5% or 8%, whether businesses can afford to hire or have to cut jobs, whether inflation eats away at your savings or stays under control, that institution is now being subjected to unprecedented pressure. What happens in the coming weeks and months will set the terms for how American monetary policy operates for a generation. The Republican senators who've broken ranks understand this. The former Fed chairs who've spoken out understand this. The question is whether enough people in positions of power will act on that understanding before the damage becomes irreversible.